All right, tonight we're back in the book of Job. And we're starting chapter 6 tonight. Moving right along. Job chapter 6. Now we just finished up chapter 5, and who was speaking in chapter 5? Mr. Eliphaz, not the one we know, but this one's a little bit older. Mr. Eliphaz has had 2 chapters worth of beginning to look down upon Job and starting the accusation process. Now, obviously, by him going first, the idea is that would symbolize that he was the elder of the crew that was there. So he would get to go first by the order of things. So, needless to say, they probably met and consulted with each other before they came to Job to find out who was going to speak and what order they were going to speak and what they were going to speak about. So, now then that Eliphaz has had his 2 chapters, and he's not done, by the way, it's just this first shot, you might say. Now, chapter 6 and chapter 7, we find Job returning with answers. Okay, Job answers Mr. Eliphaz. So in this chapter, he addresses, of course, Mr. Eliphaz's speech. And first off, you see, if you look at verse 2, oh, that my grief were what? Thoroughly weighed. What's that mean? I got a shot at that? Right. In other words, that they wouldn't just be skimmed over, but they would be thoroughly weighed out. Okay? Not just throw them on a scale and then throw them off, but thoroughly, carefully weighed. And what he's saying is that the weight of those, look at the next comparison, verse 3 says, for now it would be heavier than what? And there's a good distinction there. Why would he say sand of the sea? Okay, he's not talking about the sand on the beach. Look at the difference. What's the difference between the sand on the beach and the sand in the water? Wet sand is heavier. Obviously, that dry sand is dried up and it's not very heavy at all, is it? But that wet sand is much, much heavier. And when he says sand of the sea, he's giving you a comparison to the feeling of the weight that's upon him. So as he says that, he's introducing to us and he's wanting them to reason out this, why his sins are not sins, but why his afflictions are so heavy, and that's how they feel. And that's why he's saying, don't be impatient because I'm expressing my grief. This stuff is on me. And that's kind of the way we would put it, a lot more cruder. We'd say, boy, the thumb of the Lord's down heavy on me, or the hand of the Lord's heavy on me, and those kind of expressions. But Job is making it very, what do you call it, picturesque, or what do you call that? There's a word for that when you compare it to something else. Simile, maybe? Maybe. When you compare something to another thing to give you an idea about it, like when Jesus spoke in parables, he took practical things and made an application, and that's what Job is doing. He said, if you stop and look at the sand that's in the water and weigh that up, then that's how much it feels like on him. So Job is looking at this in these two chapters. Just looking at chapter 6, though, this time. So he wants to remind Eliphaz and his other so-called friends that, well, he's going through this and that they should be helping rather than laying on more weight. Right? Now, Eliphaz has already implied, he's already implied that Job sinned. And that's why, because he's done something and God's whooping him for it. So Job here is going to answer that and work through his feelings about what's going on. Now remember, he's expressing his feelings. He's not really wanting to die, but it's kind of a thing, that an expression that said, boy, I wish I were dead. What happens when you die, by the way? If you're with the Lord in salvation, then you're with the Lord in death, right? You're to be absent in the body is to be present with who? The Lord. So he's saying he would be better off dead than right now with all that's going on him. Now, have you ever played with that wet sand and tried to build something out of it? It gets heavy quick. It gets heavy quick. And that sand, when it starts moving, when it's wet, well, that can be a forceful thing. You ever stood there and watched the beach and watched that sand move around in the water? Boy, it can be a forceful thing. And imagine the weight of that on him. That's what he's trying to convey in this picture. He's trying to convey how much weight is on him. Now, we know how much weight is on him because we've seen him go through each of these stages of his temptation, his affliction. And the devil's pouring it on. And with Eliphaz and these four friends, it's like ice cream on the pie, so to speak. The devil's using these friends, so-called friends, to add to the fire, like putting sulfur on the fire, right? We all understand that. When you put sulfur on the fire, what happens? Makes it hotter. Like that's why the Bible speaks to the lake of fire that burneth with brimstone, which is sulfur, which makes it hotter. And the heat of the fire, I always go back to Elijah and his prayers to get a picture of that fire in my mind. I go back to Elijah when he prayed 63 words, the fire from heaven fell upon the sacrifice, consumed the sacrifice, consumed the wood, consumed the water, consumed the dust and the stones in that circle. You think about that, that's a fire, isn't it? And that's a picture of the wrath of God and a picture of God accepting of Elijah's offering, burnt offering, and then in contrast with the previous offering of Baal and their prophets, they didn't get even a spark, did they? Not a flame, not a spark, not even a puff of smoke. Didn't get nothing. And they were watching them too. No doubt they would have cheated if they could have got away with it. But too many eyes were watching them to make sure they weren't cheating, trying to sneak a match in there, or something. They didn't have matches back then, but you know what I mean. So that fire, and then you go over to Revelation chapter number 20, and you see the fire fall from heaven again against the devil's army that he's raised and encircled the camp of the saints with. There at the battle of what we call the Battle of Gog and Magog. Not really a battle, like the Battle of Armageddon. It's not really a battle. It's more like a, massacre. Okay? And all of the participants, they're on the wrong team. What happens to them? They're destroyed. They're destroyed. And those that come up against us with the devil as their leader at the last, they're going to burn thoroughly. Their physical bodies will burn thoroughly. Their souls will be escorted to hell, and about the time they clear the cell door, they're going to turn around and go back to what we call the Great White Throne of Judgment. So they're not going to get to experience hell very long. But that Great White Throne of Judgment is just but a temporary thing, because boom, 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 boom. They're going to be cast into that lake of fire. It's not going to take God very long to show them their sin, to show them their disbelief, their hatred towards the gospel, their rejection of Him, the Father and the Son and the Spirit, and they'll be ordered to be cast into the lake of fire. So that fire is a picture of the wrath of God. And here we see Job showing how heavy this burden is upon him and how heavy it is, and that's why he's using these phrases in word pictures. He says, "Oh, that my grief were thoroughly weighed and my calamity laid in the balances together." If you could pile them all up, he says, weigh them out. Now, each one of those calamities that's happened to him was a true calamity, wasn't it? Think about it. First, he lost all his livestock. His business was just thoroughly wiped out. Then he lost his children. Thoroughly lost all his children, wiped out. Then he comes home or he goes outside and he gets the news and he gets covered with the boiled flesh. I don't know, boiled, but it's not right. But he ends up with boils on his flesh. How's that? Not boiled flesh. But it probably feels like boiled flesh from head to toe. So he's got the personal sickness. He's got the emotional sickness, the grief. All of that's piled up on him. But I want you to see that, and we need to emphasize that, because when we go through these trials, you can imagine no heavier trial than what Job faced. Now, a lot of saints over the years have died in martyrdom, but that's nothing compared to this terrible affliction that Job went through. And God is recording this for us, and it's important for us to have this information, this testimony of Job, to understand He's not putting more on us than we can bear. Now recall what did God say about Job before all this started? What did He say to the devil about Job? Upright and righteous man, right? Okay. So God had already evaluated Job, and God knows the end from the beginning, doesn't He? He knew that Job wouldn't deny Him, and He allowed the devil to do this to Job. He allowed it for us, to show us it can be done, to show us we can make it through, to show us how we're to make it through. And that's the important part of this book, is to show us how we should be under the trials and affliction of life, how we should act, how we should talk, how should we not talk foolishly, and how we should still rely upon God. Even if it's a heavy hand, we can still rely on Him to carry us through. When you think about it, did Job make it through? Yep. Did he succeed in his affliction? Yep. He made it. But he made it by not accusing God falsely and by trusting in God. And knowing that God was working these things out, he's going through this process now of dealing with all this anguish, all that grief, all that pain and affliction. He's going through that process, and God's helping him to work through it in his mind. And we all have minds to think about, well, why is this going on? And then some of us get the pooch mouth. Oh, God's picking on me. Why, God, you always picking on me? I just quit. A lot of people do that nowadays, don't they? The Bible speaks at the end times there should be a great falling away. Remember that? What's that falling away? Apostasy. We see signs of that all around us, don't we? People just falling away. And that's because they don't hold up when the truth is made plain to them. They don't hold up. They don't hold root because the heat scorches them. And that Job is not getting scorched, though, is he? Now, his friends think he is, but he's not. God's still watching over him. God's keeping him alive, isn't he? He's still alive. He still can feel. He's not numb and emotionally just done. He's working through it. And that's one way that we need to remember that. When we have things happen to us, just work through it with the right perspective and the right approach. That God knows what He's doing. If nobody else knows what He's doing, God knows what He's doing. And is doing it. Now, granted, the devil has been given permission to do it, but God's allowed it. And God's limited the devil. You can't kill him. Now, he was allowed to kill his children. He was allowed to kill his business. But he wasn't allowed to kill Job, and that's for the very reason we have Job here today. So that we could see how we can go through the mud and the hog pen of life and make it. And Job made it. So his picture here, he says, rather than all these accusations, Mr. Eliphaz, why don't you look at my circumstances? Why don't you look and weigh them out and see how heavy they are and give me the right to work through this and express myself as best I can? Sometimes it's just, remember that the Bible teaches us that sometimes the Holy Spirit has to interpret our utterings and our groanings, doesn't he? Because we just can't say it in words. And Job's very eloquent, even with these boils from head to toe. How eloquent would you all be? How good do you think you could speak? And that's in the midst of his grief, his personal affliction, the loss of his family, all that. He's in the middle of that, and he's still being fairly eloquent. So that speaks to his character, even in temptation. And that's something that we can pattern our lives off after, is how Job handled himself, even in this hardship, and the continuing hardship of his friends for what, 33 more chapters or so? I mean, think about that, 34 more chapters. Think about how that Job endured all of this, and then here comes God. Imagine that. He's trusting in God, now he gets to see him. And then what does he do? He falls on his face. Falls on his face and confesses he's been speaking as a man. But it's interesting at the end. I like the beginning just as good as I do the end. At the end, God has Job pray for his friends, doesn't he? And Job could have said, "Them sorry rascals? Them guys has beat me while I was down, or stomping me into the dirt and accused me all kinds of manner of stuff. Why in the world would I pray for them, God?" God says, "Unless you intervene, I'll take care of them." Yep. So that's a picture. You remember on the cross, what was one of those sayings of Christ on the cross? When they were wagging their tongues and mocking him and making fun of him and all that. He said, "Lord, lay not this sin to their charge." Think about that. And that's, remember Stephen, we saw him doing the same thing. "Lord, lay not this sin to their charge." So we see that Job has that same righteous mindset. And that's where our mindset has to be in the afflictions that we're seeing. So Eliphaz, he thought that he had laid Job into the grave, so to speak, with argument. He knocked him out. Okay? Job says, you ain't even begun to imagine the things that are happening to me. You haven't even begun to understand the weight of all this upon me. So you've never had something like this happen. And that would be true. You think about it, I don't think anybody has had that kind of affliction, that kind of trial like Job had. The loss of everything, even including yourself, your personal physical health, and remember there's another little one there that is, what does his wife come in and tell him? She told him to curse God and die. Well, that was just the devil speaking there, wasn't it? Trying to get him to quit. So this is his last tactic, the last tactic of the devil. You get these boys to beat on him while he's down. But Job says, no, I'm going to work through this. And you'll have to forgive my expressions of grief and anguish. You'll have to give me time to work through this. I'm weighing out. I'm working through it and measuring it and looking at it, and I'm assessing what's going on so that I can deal with it in the right way. Now, all throughout the book of Job, we see a little bit of pity by Job, but not to the point that we have our pity. Remember, most of us, when something bad goes wrong, we get the pooch mouth on God, don't we? Say, believe I'll quit. That ain't for me. Getting too hard. Call that the pooch mouth. Well, Job's not getting the pooch mouth. He's just feeling sorry for himself. And I don't know anybody alive that wouldn't feel sorry for themselves in this situation. How would you feel? Yeah. Much worse. Because we tend to get carried off by emotions rather than the right thoughts that we should. So we have to be careful when we're going through these trials and afflictions to not let the emotions overweigh the truth. The truth. The truth is that God allowed this to happen, and because of his afflictive providences, he's going through this, and he's going to have to go through it, and he knows that, but he's working through it. So he's not being impatient, okay? He's not doing that, but he is feeling the groans and the moanings and the charges which they're laying on him. They're adding to the weight of the problem, aren't they? Now, the Bible teaches us, and Christ teaches several places in the gospel, that we're to help share one another's load, aren't we? We're to help with the burdens of our neighbors. But what should they have been doing for Job? Praying for him and helping him. I mean, grab you a pot shard and start scraping. You know, get some ointment, get some of that balm of Gilead and put it on the wounds and bind them up and help him to start feeling a little better. And then get him up and get him start walking around physically to where he's able to. And then start dealing with the other circumstances. What's he going to do next? You know, are you going to start your business over again? I happen to have a pair of camels, or I happen to have a pair of oxen, or a pair of sheep, and bring it all to him and say, now, Job, you can get started again. And that's exactly what happened in the end, wasn't it? But it wasn't the 4 friends, it was the rest of the people that he had been good to, that he had been righteous in front of, that he had taught and helped in their afflictions. They bring their love offerings to Job, and Job begins to once again prosper like he was. So as you weigh out your trouble and your trials, don't set long on those. Set more on what God's trying to show you than what's going on. In other words, Job could have just sat there in grief about the loss of his children and went absolutely crazy. You know, he didn't. He's not so much weighing out his problems as he is weighing out the solutions to the problems. Now, what am I going to do about this, and how am I going to work through this? And of course, his friends are distracting him. He wants his calamities to be laid in the balances. He wants you to know that these griefs have borne down hard on him. And when you've got something as heavy as wet sand, you have to take note of it, don't you? You have to observe that it's happening to you. I mean, as you're scraping them boils, you're going to observe something's happening to you, right? You're going to feel it physically. So he's feeling the whole emotions of the man, both spiritual and physical. He's going through this. And that's how the devil's attacking him so rapidly. Remember when one set of animals were captured and carried off? Boom, here come the next messenger. Boom, here come the next one and the next one. And finally, he realizes he's lost everything. And then his wife comes out and says, curse God and die. And then the boils and all that come. And then the ice cream on the top of the pie, his friends come and start giving him down the road. So see these arguments, and there's a lot of truth like I want you to take note of. These men speak with good wisdom. It's good wisdom, but the application's off. They're looking at it from the wrong perspective. And that's why the Jews always had that in their minds, that if you were rich and you had everything you needed, God was blessing you. But if something bad happened to you, you made God mad. That's not the way it works. And Jesus had to correct that thinking in his disciples, because that's what they've been taught all their lives, that if you were rich, you were blessed. If not, you're not blessed. So we have to overcome that kind of thinking and realize that this affliction, this trial is heavy, but we're going to have to get through it. We have to realize we can get through it. And all you got to do is skip ahead to the last chapter and say, he got through it. How did he get through it? Well, it wasn't the help of his friends, was it? He got through it by relying upon God. He knew that God was there. Remember, there's a good verse over in that chapter 19 talks about, for I know that my Redeemer liveth. That was his hope, wasn't it? He's trusting in that. Hey, if I die, I know I get to see him face to face. So as you think about that, observe how we would, and put yourself in the place of Job, and how would you react if you were Job? And then be truthful and say, well, this is how I would react, right? In truth. Not in how you think you would act, but how you would act. How do we act in trials and tribulations and afflictions? So here we are in these first 3 verses, and we see Job's got, he said, hey, wait a minute, let's get down to the nitty-gritty and look at all this stuff that's on me, and allow me a little bit of grief, allow me a little bit of emotion, allow me a little bit of this pain and suffering. It's heavy on me. I want you to see that, and I'm going to have to work through it, and you're going to have to be patient with me while I work through it. That's basically what he's telling Eliphaz here in these answers. So read ahead in the next few verses, read 4, 5, 6, and we'll cover those next time, Lord willing. All right, we'll stop there. Let's all stand.